Hi everyone, Storm Anderson here from Kumo Partners, and today we're going to pick up where we left off on our Ruddr integration. And so we're working here in a data flow inside of our environment, and we're working with the Ruddr API to pull back time entries. So from our last video, this is where we left off with the single table. We cleaned up some of it, did some expansions to pull everything apart and really set it right. But today we want to take it one step further and really start to tackle one of the main issues that comes up with this strategy is when an API has some type of limit on the number of records that'll come back per call. And so in this case, if we go over to the Ruddr API, if we look at the list time entries here, this is what we were looking at last time. You can see that we do have a parameter called limit, but the maximum number here is 100 and the default is even set to 10. And so if we're thinking about time entries or some of these other tables that might have well beyond 100, right? Tens of thousands maybe perhaps. This is going to be a difficult thing to not just call one time and hope for everything to come. We're going to have to figure out a way to dynamically call this URL or this API to be able to give us all 10 to 100,000 records. And so how we do that is utilizing these additional parameters starting after or ending before, depending how you want to look at it. But we're going to use the starting after. And what this will do is allow us to pull items 1 through 100 and then pass the ID of record 100 here, if you think of it that way, so that the next call will actually come with records 101 to 200, records 201 to 300, etc. And so let's come back over here to our data flow. And what we're going to do is just go ahead and create a blank query. So what the original expression was, pretty straightforward. So we're setting a header variable. The source was calling web contents and passing those headers over. We're using the JSON.document to be able to convert that and then passing that on so that we could do the other manipulations. What we're going to paste in here, and I'll have this available in the blog post and the YouTube video here as well, is a little bit more updated format with a key distinction here on line 1. And so what we're going to do today is create a custom function in the M language or within Power Query. And how we do that is by this notation of 1, putting parentheses, and these creating we're in effect creating parameters we're going to pass to this function. So start date filter, and the last record is the representation of that starting after. And then if you just need to make sure to put this little arrow at the end. So now what we have for the rest of this is just pretty much the same thing. The one difference to call out is that rather than having the URL be entirely together, we separated out the base of the URL. And now you can see that we are using the relative path variable here within web contents to call directly to in this case, the time entries. And so what you can see is we're still hitting the time entries like before. We're setting the default limit equals 100, or rather overwriting the default of 10 to set it to 100. We're bringing in the date after. So this is just an example of how we can use the start date filter to do some type of distinction or filtering beyond just the pulling all records. And then we have the final parameter, which is the starting after one. And you can see that we set that to the last record variable or property here. The rest of this is the same JSON response. It's still the JSON. So I'm going to hit next. Actually, one thing, I need to update the bear token. Okay, reset that. So now you can see that what happens with a custom function is that it actually gives us the ability to now call it right here within Power Query. And so you can see our 2 parameters that we created, and then we have the ability to invoke it. So for Ruddr, when we want to filter on a date, you can see here the date after. The notation for how this needs to go across is YYYY MM-DD. And that works in the format of a greater than. So if I wanted to just say what are the records for since last month, so I'll do 2024-04-01, and then I'll leave last record blank. And so now we can see that it did return, and it returned 2 important properties that I want you to make sure to be aware of. One is the results, and the has more, which is just a Boolean of true false. We don't necessarily really rely on the has more, though there is maybe a way that we could design it to be. But instead, we really need to be aware of the fact that when we call the query, we want to be able to access the results list here. And so even in here directly in this expression, if I did do something like this, you'll notice that what this does is navigate us into that list. And so these are the actual results that are coming back. And you can see now that they are limited to 100 because all we're doing here is simply calling the query one time with this date filter applied to it, right? And these are the records that we're getting back in the results property here. So I'm going to leave that there and just show you that this is the way that we would call the function directly. Now what we're going to do is move from not just calling it once to get the 100 records, but also calling it dynamically to get 1,000, 10,000, beyond. So let's go ahead and create a blank query here. And we're going to rely on a capability called the List.Generate function. And so over here in the Microsoft Learn, you can see that this is an article List.Generate, and it has this syntax, 4 different parameters that you can see here. And I'm going to paste this all in the code so you guys can get access to this, see it a little bit better. But the best example to show you here is this example 2, where in the first expression, we set 2 properties or variables that we're going to track, X and Y. This is the condition or the criteria that we're going to check for continuing to do it again. And then this is where we really apply the condition for the next iteration, finally deciding on what we're going to return as the output for this List.Generate. So if I come over here, I'm going to paste all of this in. And this is just the schema that I had from there. But this is us essentially using that same ideology of the List.Generate and now bringing it to life using our query to be able to do this dynamically. So the first thing you'll notice here is I do just create a random property or variable, if you will, date to text, and we're just simply getting the start of the month. So where I did the start of April, even though we're in May here, this is actually going to get me May 1st in the format that we need for the Ruddr API. We're going to set another variable data list, and this is going to be our actual List.Generate here. And so I put all of these notes in here just to really help you understand as much as possible. But this does follow the same ideology of what List.Generate is doing. So this is our first parameter. And rather than X and Y, what we're doing is we're setting the data property. And you can notice we're using this try otherwise pattern where we're trying the query, we're passing in the start date, and we're not passing in a last record. But this is essentially getting the first 100 records and putting them into this data variable. For the last record, I want you to call attention to 2 different parts, which is one, here is what we just did in that example before, right? Where we are calling the query with the start date and we're accessing the results property on that. So you can think of this as getting the first 100 records again. It is duplicate here, but you can see that we're getting the last 100 records. And then we're using the list.last function to get the last ID property of that list in results. So now you can see that for the first setup or the first initial values, we have all 100 records in data, and then last record actually has the last ID in that data set. Parameter 2 is pretty, at least simpler in nature compared to these other ones. All we're going to say is the condition to check is that data is not equal to null. So if we do get null data back, then this will exit out of the iteration you can think of. And so for parameter 3, you can see we're pretty much doing the same thing as before. The one difference being we're doing the try otherwise again. Here's our query with the start date. And you can see that this is how we're actually passing in the last record variable. And so you can think of this being set to ID 100. And then as we try the next iteration, we're starting it with the query, but we're actually passing in ID 100 here. And then likewise, what we're doing for the last record property is the same exact thing where we're using the query function, we're passing in last record, and then we're accessing the results to use the list.last to get the last ID. I know the notation can be a little complex to look at, especially depending on how familiar you are with M, but this is at least approaching it and trying to break it down as much as possible. Finally, the piece here is each data. This is what we want to return. We don't need data and last record. All we need is data. And data list is simply the list that we're generating, and that's why it's here. So if I go ahead and hit next, you'll see that this runs. It's going to run for a little bit. And what we have is 5 entries here with record. So this can look like it didn't work right, but the idea is that each of these is actually a batch of 100 records. And this is because how the formula is going through, what we're returning is just the results. So this is that each data, that last parameter, showing us that, okay, this is what I'm returning, this is what I'm returning. These are the 5 iterations it went through. And so now we can start to come back into doing what we did in the last video, which is let's convert our list to a table. We don't need to set any of these. We now have a column of records. Let's go ahead and expand that. And why that's a record, just in case you were wondering, is because we have both of these properties. So what we want to do is actually uncheck has more here, just have results. We don't need the original prefix, and hit OK. We have the results now as a list. One more expansion. And just to show you that this is more than 100, now you can see that these are all the records from all the entries coming through. So again, we'll expand again. And now we have the properties that we're expecting at least to come back. So I'll hit OK. And there we go. And so just to clean everything up, we will have to go through those steps again. That was technically the different query that we had all of those procedures. So we can just run through these really quickly. We do want the ID to be a property that we store as an ID. So let's switch that to text. We'll scroll through the rest of these here, just kind of checking which ones. These are all fine. Date, we want as a date property. Minutes, we could set to whole number. Timer started at, that's fine, we can ignore. Created at is the other important one here. We want this to be a date time. And then we will need to just make sure to expand all of these again. So this is where we were using original name. And can continue to project client, make sure to do that one. All these nested ones can give you a little bit of a headache here. Task. And there we go. And so the rest of these is billable. This was the only other 2 that we changed to Boolean. All right, so that is about all of the changes we need to do here. The one final thing we can do and really need to do is just to double check for empty values. And so if we do pull up the filter for ID here, it does say list may be incomplete, doesn't show. If we do load more, you'll notice that there are some null values. And this might be because of how the List.Generate is set up, but that is where it is easy enough to just, rather than trying to re-engineer the List.Generate function, we can just filter out any null values here, and that'll take care of the fact that now we won't have any null properties. All right, so let's go ahead and click next. All right, so just before we move on, let's just call this time entries v2, and we can go ahead and hit next. And so we're not going to load the other table. So if it's not set this way, make sure to reset it and then do not load. We just want to load the time entries v2 here. So we're going to select to load to new table. And let's go ahead and just create this table again. We're going to call it time entries part 2. Go ahead and hit next. And so we aren't going to load the initial table. So I'll just turn this to do not load. We're actually going to create a new table here just to distinguish it from the other one, and I'll call this Ruddr time entry, or rather entries. And we're going to start to set up a few different things. The primary name column, this I really wouldn't change anything particular. We could use the ID if we wanted, but we could just leave it to auto-generate. It just depends on your choice. I do want to call out though the alternate key column. We do want to set the ID property. So whatever you're dumping the Ruddr ID into, in this case just the name of the field itself, that I would call out is what we want to distinguish. And so from the rest of this is pretty straightforward to what we had done last time, where most of these columns are just preset. So date created, there you can see the date and time, date only. ID is text, which is what we want. The rest of these we could maybe just set to text fields rather than multi-line, just to clean it up a little bit. Minutes is fine. Notes should probably stay multi-line. Project client ID, project client name, all of these can switch though. So I'll just clean these up. All right. And so now after switching all of those, we do have this table, all of this configured. We can go ahead and publish. So while that runs, we're just going to also edit the incremental refresh. This is how we're going to distinguish the fact that when the first time this runs, this data flow will pull everything back, maybe by design. Certainly there's other ways you could approach that with that start date filter or beyond of how we want to limit the first batch. But for everything going forward, that's where the edit incremental refresh properties here are super beneficial. And so normally it defaults to just a full refresh, which means every time this runs, it's going to query all the results to try and validate what needs to be updated. Instead, we can say, let's do an incremental refresh, and we're going to base that off of one of these date time, in this case, created at. So refresh rows from the past 14 would be essentially from the last 2 weeks, anything that's been created. Maybe it's been modified, right? But based on its created date, we're going to go ahead and look to the past 14 days. We could also say maybe the last month, depending how many records that is for your organization. All of these are things you can kind of consider. So in this case, I will leave it to 28, and we can put that here to 28 days. You can see there is a property where this is just looking at the complete days rather than looking at it directly from this current point in time or with the point in time when it's run, right? So for here, I will actually just turn this on. It's not going to make so much difference, but it is worth distinguishing. I'll go ahead and save. All right, and we'll see that the refresh failed here. There's a quick thing that I want to call out. So if we go ahead and click on this, depending on how you're working with the data, again, we're really looking at just Ruddr here, but this could be any API we're getting results from. We're seeing that we're getting a mashup error, and that's because of this value general PTO. And so what's happening is that even though we thought we expanded everything, there's still record values coming back here, right? It's this record to type text. So I'm going to close this. Let's go back into edit. And what's actually happening is the value over here, scrolling to it, it's this time off type. So right now it's just set to any, right? And we're seeing null values. If I try to filter here, we're not actually seeing anything either. And if I try to load more, we don't get anything. But however, if I do try to sort this, this is where we'll get the error that operator blank. Essentially, this is now where we can see that the record concept is coming into play. But the way to do that through the kind of easy transformations here is not really giving us a direct way to do that. So I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this sort. Let's go to one of these expanded, and we can see what this formula looks like. And so if I want to insert my own step using this kind of format here to do this on the time off type, I can go ahead and go to advanced editor again. This is where we had our original base of the query, but now we can see all of the additional steps that I've added here. And so what we can do is just let's copy one of these existing ones that are pretty straightforward. We can use just copy roll there, and maybe to make it easier, let's just change this one. So how these are passed is that you can see expanded task is expanded task here. You can see expanded role is going to be here. So what we're looking for is time off type. And then now I can put that here. And what we need to do is instead of it being role, now you can see it's ID name, time off type ID, time off type dot name. Now I'll hit OK. And we should be able to scroll over. And we'll see that these are blank, but now if I try to sort, I don't get an error, and I actually get the value of what that should be. So now if I go ahead and move forward again, let's go to time entries v2. We can see that all of this is set, but now what we need is name, we'll leave blank. That's not what I'm looking for. The time off type, we're just going to set to the time off ID. Where did it go? Oh, we can see that role stayed on it, but that's fine. You can get the gist. And now we can see that the next refresh is in progress. Those incremental refresh updates are set. And at this point, we're good to go. And so this will return the results. We'll see all of those time entries coming into Power BI, or rather Dataverse. And then the next, looking forward to the next videos, we'll look at how we can assess that data a little bit more detail and go from there. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for the next one.